O sacrament most holy, O sacrament divine, all praise and all thanksgiving be every moment thine. O sacrament most holy, O sacrament divine, all praise and all thanksgiving be every moment thine. O sacrament most holy, O sacrament divine, all praise and all thanksgiving be every moment thine. There are confessions happening all throughout the time when we're in adoration, and so you should feel welcome to leave at any point when I'm speaking and go to confession, especially if you're having bad thoughts about what I'm saying. Good brothers and sisters, what a joy and an honor it is to be here with you at the beginning of the great season of Advent. The readings and the sense of Advent at the very beginning focuses upon the coming or the return of the King. Of course, in Advent, we remember the three comings of Christ, that Christ came in history, that he comes to us in mystery, and that he is coming in majesty. And strangely, we begin our Advent reflections thinking about his coming in majesty. Partly, I think, because Advent culminates with his coming, our commemoration of his coming in history at Christmas, and partly because of the proximity of the beginning of Advent to the great feast of Christ the King. That feast of Christ the King was established, as you probably know, by Pope Pius XI in 1925. And the historical context of it is important. It's important because Pius XI was the shepherd of the Universal Church just a little more than 100 years after the French Revolution of 1789. That revolution was probably the most traumatic thing which happened to the Catholic Church. In generations upon generations, France, of course, was the eldest daughter of the Church, a society which had been thoroughly evangelized. And here, all of a sudden, because of various ideas which had become ascendant, there was a violent revolution, the execution of priests and nuns, the official disestablishment of the church, the rise of a dictator who was Lenin before his time. It was very traumatic for the church. And for most of the 19th century, the church was grappling with what to do about that. That includes the convening of the First Vatican Council. And then in 1925, remember that we're talking about a handful of years after great events of doom had gripped the 20th century in 1917, two of them. In 1917 was the revolution of the Bolsheviks in Russia. 1917 also was the institution of a new constitution for Mexico, which was rabidly anti-Catholic, more or less making priests hunted criminals. And that resulted in the Cristero War. And so in the midst of all of this, Pius XI says, we need to establish a feast for Christ the King. We need to acclaim the kingship of Christ. And he said that we needed to, because they want to drive us underground, because the atheistic and secularistic thrust of the society in the aftermath of the French Revolution and in such events as the communists in Russia or the anti-clericalists in Mexico, all of that was a sign that we were being driven underground. And so it was important that Christ be acclaimed as king, not simply in sermons, but out on the streets and in workplaces. Pius XII called for adoration, but he also called for processions. So there was a political genesis to this idea of Christ as king. Of course, though, it goes much farther back than that, to the scriptures themselves, where the people of Israel were waiting for the king, the descendant of David. It goes back to the conversation that Jesus had with Pilate. And it wasn't simply political. In the encyclical Quas Primas, which established the feast of Christ the King, Pius XI also gave a theological reason. and he pointed to the writings of St. Cyril of Alexandria. And that's what I want to focus on as we think about the kingship of Christ, because I think that the kingship of Christ, at the beginning of Advent, the return of the King, properly understood, can distill for us the whole meaning and purpose of our Catholic faith from top to bottom. That's what I think it offers to us. St. Cyril of Alexandria said that the incarnation, the Son of God, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, taking on flesh, uniting humanity and divinity, marrying heaven and earth, bringing together in nuptial mystery the visible and the invisible, was what establishes Christ's reign, because then there is an empire where both men and angels must fall down before him. And this is a question then, he says, of the marriage of humanity and divinity. That question of marriage is actually central to our understanding. And if we don't get it, we don't get him. If we don't understand it and what God means by it, we don't understand our salvation. Let me say what I mean by that. When we're talking about marriage, of course, we can treat it in all kinds of different ways. You can talk about it from an historical perspective and think about how marriage has appeared in every human society in various forms. You can think about it sociologically and consider the cultural aspects which need to be present in order for marriage and family truly to thrive. You can take a practical approach and say, well, what are the habits for seeking the right mate and for building a happy marriage and a happy family? You can think about it legally or politically and say, what are the arrangements within a society from the standpoint of law which will protect marriage and foster it and protect the family? But none of those approaches is the approach which I think we should take. We can consider those different aspects, especially in the face of deep confusion about the nature of marriage in our culture right now, and even maybe especially in California. But we could take not just an historical or sociological or practical or legal or political view, we can take a cosmic view of marriage. To have a cosmic view of marriage is to see marriage the way that God sees it, and to understand marriage the way that God understands it. To do that is to see how marriage helps us to understand the plan of God for the human race, and also pulls together our access to the heavenly harmonies, the harmonies of heaven, which are brought to us through this great mystery of marriage. I'm not trying here to romanticize something which is mundane, but it is the case that people have lost the sense of what marriage is in our own time. And because of that, we don't understand God. Because we've lost our sense of marriage, we don't understand God. And so one has to take a cosmic view, because if you don't, then you can't simply put up with the great grief that marriage brings. Because marriage is, I don't have to tell you this, in many ways a road of grief and suffering. To bring two fallen human beings together, to share a life together, will not go well. Now, it's meant to go well in the end. It's meant to be for the sanctification of the spouses. But it's difficult. You know, we joke about the things which cause us pain. That's why so many comedians suffer from severe depression, because those who are saddest or who take the tragedy of life most seriously are the ones who make us laugh. Did you hear the one about the man and his wife who was sitting in bed one night, and she said, if I die, would you get remarried? And he thought for a moment, and he said, I think I would get remarried. You know, I don't want to be alone, and so I think I'd get married again. His wife was silent for a while, and she said, do you think you'd let her use my pots and pans? And he thought, and he said, yeah, I think so. You know, I'd get hungry, and so I think I would let her use my pots and pans. Your pots and pans. Would you let her drive my car? He said, gosh, you know, I've got mine, and yours is out there. I think so. You know, we've got to get around. And then his wife thought for a very long time, and she was really perplexed and troubled by this, and she said, would you, and then she paused, and then she said, would you let her use my golf clubs? And he said, no, she's left-handed. You see, you laugh because it's tragic. It touches upon this question of suffering. And so if we don't see the meaning of marriage or the purpose of it, then it's very reasonable to ask, why should I sacrifice my own wants and desires to live with another person? Why should I allow my life to be invaded by children whose special talent is to throw the lives of their parents into an uproar? Why should I do this? And these, I think, are important questions. There was a time, I think, in a pre-industrial age, there was a time in which there wouldn't have been a question about getting married and raising a family as the normal, regular thing for people to do. Children were needed. They were needed in society for work. When you're down on the farm, you need children in order to run the farm. They were needed to defend you against your enemies. They were needed to care for the elderly. But now, in our modern technological age, we don't need children anymore as workers or as soldiers or as social security. And so as a result, it's so easy to begin then to see marriage as an arrangement for the mutual benefit of the spouses, according to personal preference, a lifestyle choice, and not a serious commitment to bring about something serious in the world. That causes us, everyone, to lose that vision of marriage. Has all kinds of effects. Of course, less people are getting married. Those who do get married are having many more complications along the way. We're enshrining as marriage arrangements which until very recently no one would have ever considered to be marriage. But I think an additional difficulty here is that approach causes the trouble of us not understanding God. Because God uses the image of marriage to tell us what he is up to in saving us. Let me tell you what I mean. The whole purpose of the Catholic faith comes down to this. God, who did not have to create anything at all, chose, not having to do it, but because he wanted to bring into existence creatures who otherwise would not have existed and could not have existed. And then having done that, having created us, he gives us to share in his own life. The whole purpose of the Catholic faith, then, is to incorporate us into the divine life. St. Peter, in his second letter, says that we become partakers of the divine nature. The Church Fathers said that the whole purpose of our faith is not to prolong our lives, either here in this world, increase it in quality or in quantity. It's not to make us more moral. It's not so that we can escape punishment and retribution. It's not so that we can serve the poor and make the world a better place. All of those things are component of a greater, deeper truth, which is this. The point of the Catholic faith is to divinize us, to bring us into the divine nature. St. Athanasius of Alexandria, in his treatise on the Incarnation, says, man became God so that God might become man. God became man so that man might become God. God became man. Why? So that man might become God. The purpose is to divinize us, to deify us. In Greek, it is theosis. How does God do that? How does God make us, who are just a handful of dirt, held together by water and spirit? How does God incorporate us into his nature? In the scriptures, we see two images. He adopts us as his children, and he marries the human race. He adopts us as his children, and he marries the human race. this image of marriage is lost upon us. Also this image of children and being adopted, because we sentimentalize children and we sentimentalize marriage. In order to understand what God is up to, we have to adopt a more traditional vision of marriage. Tenderness and affection, mutual love, was always part of marriage. But in traditional societies, marriage had a different purpose altogether, above and beyond tenderness and mutual affection. It was to establish the status of the spouses. It was to fix them within the structure of the society. And so this was especially true of brides. If a woman married a king, she became a queen. If she married below her status, she entered her husband's family and was lowered in her own status. We have to understand this vision of marriage in order to understand what God is doing. When the scriptures say that God marries Israel, or when Paul in Ephesians says that Christ marries the church, what God is doing by that nuptial mystery is raising Israel to his own level. He is establishing the church. He is establishing us at his level. This is about divinization. This is about deification. God marries us in order that we might share in his nature and be godlike ourselves, that we might be divine. This is extraordinarily important for us to understand. And we see this from the beginning to the end of Scripture. This is why Genesis opens with a marriage, the creation of Adam and Eve, who become one flesh. This is why Revelation ends with marriage, the wedding feast of the Lamb. The whole of Revelation is caught up in this great mystery. And so in order to understand that, for instance, if we look at the genealogy in St. Matthew's Gospel, we read this, on Christmas Eve at the Vigil Mass. This is a long list of all of Jesus' ancestors, kings, great and mighty kings of old, David, his sons, and his sons' sons. And then among them, there are 5 women. There are 5 women in the genealogy of Matthew. Do you know who they are? The first is Tamar. Tamar was the daughter-in-law of Judah. Judah is the son of Jacob who establishes the royal line, the line of kings. Judah gives Tamar his first son in marriage, dies childless. His second son in marriage dies childless. He thinks that Tamar is cursed, so he does not give her his third son. And so Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute, seduces her father-in-law, and bears him twin sons who become part of the genealogy of Jesus. Tamar. Then there's Rahab. Rahab was the prostitute of Jericho when the scouts came into the promised land. She's the one who held them overnight and helped them to escape, having extracted a promise that if Jericho would fall and if Israel was triumphant, that they would protect her. And so they did. A Canaanite prostitute married then into the line of Judah. Rahab became the mother of Boaz. Boaz was the husband of the third woman in the genealogy, Ruth. Ruth was not a Jewish woman either. She was a Moabite woman because Naomi, her mother-in-law, went to Moab during the great famine. And when the famine was over and she was returning to her home area of Judah, Bethlehem, she said to her 2 daughters-in-law who had lost their husbands, "I don't have any more sons to give you. Go back to your people." One of them, Orpah, for whom Oprah Winfrey is named, did go back. But Ruth famously did not. Ruth said to Naomi, "Don't send me away. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And saying, no, Naomi took her back to Bethlehem and gave her to Boaz, the son of Rahab, and her closest kinsman, and brought her and gave her to be married in this way. Ruth became the grandmother of David the king. Ruth, this Moabite woman, became the grandmother of David the king. And David's great-grandmother was Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute. Who's the fourth woman? Bathsheba. Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah, who was one of David's mighty men, the wife of a soldier, no one in particular. David saw her bathing, brought her to himself, had relations with her. She was pregnant, and so David murders Uriah by proxy and takes Bathsheba as his wife. That child dies, but the next child is Solomon. And the fifth woman is Mary of Nazareth, who was just a peasant woman who nobody knew anything about. Nobody knew who Mary was. She was living in a dusty outpost in a vast and sprawling empire. And yet God set his heart on her, chose her, sent an angel to her, and now all the angels and all the world knows who she is. In a few short days, one of the most significant buildings in the world will reopen, the Cathedral of Paris. And the name of that building? Notre Dame, Our Lady. With each of these five women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary, with each of them, their marriage, Mary, the spouse of the Holy Spirit, raised them to catastrophically high heights. With each of these women, they were incorporated into the royal line, although they were Canaanites and Moabites and prostitutes and the wife of soldiers. It's the same in our own time. Think of Kate Middleton. Here is a middle-class girl. She marries a prince and becomes a princess, a duchess, and probably a queen. She gains this entirely by her marriage. Open to the pages of the 45th Psalm, and you see it. This is subtitled A Love Song. And what do we read? It is addressed to the bride. And the bride is told this in the 45th Psalm: forget your people and your father's house, because the king will desire your beauty. And so there is an attractiveness, a love, even an erotic component there. But then what does the psalm go on to say? The psalm next says that what will happen as a result of her marriage is that the wealthiest people from all around the world will bring her rich gifts. Her sons will become princes. Her name will be celebrated all throughout the world. And she gains this entirely by her marriage. Now, I want to ask you this. In your spiritual life, in your walk with him, what do you think that he's up to? What do you think he's wanting of you during this Advent and in your life? What do you think he's asking? Probably you're wrong. Probably you're not quite understanding what his desire for you is. You think he wants to make you a better person. He wants that, but he wants way more. You think he wants you to serve the poor and the needy. He wants that, but he wants much more. You think that he wants to save you from everlasting death. Yes, but that's too little for him. Jesus comes to us upon this altar as priest, as victim, and as bridegroom. I have a little nephew whose birthday is today. He turns 9. He wants to marry every girl. Every girl he wants to marry. He flirts with every female person he meets, he flirts with them. He's going to marry every girl. Jesus, in the Eucharist, is like my little nephew. He wants to marry everyone. He wants to be joined in one flesh union with you. He comes as bridegroom. O heavenly ruler, comforter, Spirit of truth, you who are everywhere present and fill all things, O treasury of blessing, giver of life, fire of God's love, Father of the poor, come dwell within us, enlighten, guide, strengthen, defend, and console us. Cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. And so we've begun to see a little bit about what God is up to in saving the human race, and what it means for Christ to be king. Once again, according to Cyril of Alexandria, the incarnation is the key to Christ's kingship. The return of the king, which we remember during this Advent season, which we long for, which we yearn for, that return is not simply the return of our liege Lord. That return is the coming of the one who loves us and wants to bring us into his life so that we can become partakers in the divine nature. Because God, who is king, has deigned to marry the human race, we have become royalty. This ancient and traditional understanding of marriage means that those who partake of the life of God in this way become divinized, are married to the Godhead. Marriage is so central to our experience, and we see that it haunts the human race from the beginning. If you go back 4,000 years to Hammurabi's code, you see all kinds of statutes and regulations around the relations between man and woman and family life. Marriage is all over in those fountains of Western civilization, the Iliad and the Odyssey, where we hear about the marriage between Agamemnon and his devoted wife Clytemnestra, or the marriage of Helen with Menelaus, and how Helen being taken away to another bond with Paris caused the Trojan War. We read about it in the regulations and rules and speeches of antiquity from the Roman Senate. Virgil writes of marriage. Dante writes of marriage. The sonnets of Shakespeare. The legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Most of the great novels of the last 300 years. Think of Anna Karenina or the novels of Jane Austen. Even that greatest accomplishment of all of Western civilization, the film The Princess Bride and its depiction of marriage. All of it, from beginning to end, marriage steals the show. This is the case for the sacred scripture as well. But God means that quite on purpose. As I said before, the Bible begins with a marriage, the creation of man and woman. Be fruitful and multiply. For this reason, a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife, and the two become one flesh, and ends with the wedding feast of the Lamb. From beginning to end. You don't believe me? Let me tell you. Let's start at the beginning and go to the end. I have many hours, didn't you say? It's Pacific time, and I've come from Central time, so I have 2 extra hours. I've gained 2 hours today. I'm going to spend them on you. So if we look in Genesis, of course, we see that humanity is created. Humanity, of course, appears in a great kind of diversity. There are tall people and short people, aggressive people and peaceful people. People are light-skinned and dark-skinned. People are brilliant or slow. There are all kinds of different people. But all of that is accidental. The only distinguishing characteristics that Genesis gives us is the creation of man and woman. This strange complementarity is there. And when the man is there alone before the creation of woman, it's clear that he is inadequate and incomplete. John Paul II spoke about this at length in his Theology of the Body. And so the woman then is the great masterpiece which brings to fullness humanity. And then there's that complementarity of love which echoes and mirrors the Blessed Trinity. Very beautiful and tremendously important. Also, human beings participate with God, are joined with God in the great task of bringing immortal souls into the world. And so from the very beginning, this question of marriage is central to the identity of the human race. And we see there already God's intention to divinize Adam and Eve. And yet, in order for that to happen, they need to pass through a test, not an arbitrary test, but a test to establish their full acceptance and receiving of the goodness of God. God will not force them, and so it is a question of their free will. He did not make them to be robots or muskrats, but he wants to raise them to his own level. We all know what happens next. That aboriginal catastrophe, which is the beginning of all our sorrow, the fall in Eden. Notice what happens. The rupture is mostly described in terms of marriage and childbearing. Eve is still the mother of all the living, and yet now she will bring forth her children in suffering. Those children, when they are born after the fall, are a source of great hope, and yet everything goes wrong. Cain and Abel become rivals, and Cain kills Abel, and there is bloodshed upon the face of the earth. Everything deteriorates from there, and it begins with a rupture in marriage and family. Then the scriptures turn to catastrophe after catastrophe, disaster after disaster, all of the fruits of the rupture between humanity and its creator, between divinity and the human race. But God, who is all love, straight through, could not bear this, could not let it stand. So what does he do? God scours the face of the earth and finds in Ur of the Chaldeans a married couple, Abram and Sarai. He calls them, he makes to them extravagant promises that seem to be beyond the possibility of fulfillment. He gives them new names to establish their new identity, Abraham and Sarah. And he saves them. He rescues them. Now, it can be rightly said, if we understand the scriptures, that in the whole history of the human race, God has only ever saved one family. Ever. The family of Abraham and Sarah, and that's it. That is the only family he has saved. What he has done in a remarkable way is he has found a way to adopt the whole of the human race into that family, starting with the progeny of Abraham and Sarah, the Jewish people, and then spreading out to the whole rest of the human race. All of us who know salvation know it because we are sons and daughters of Abraham, our father in faith. When the children of Abraham found themselves in bitter slavery in Egypt, God intervened with signs and wonders at the Red Sea and led them into a desert. The desert is not accidental. The desert was meant to be the place where God would woo his beloved, where he would pursue the one whom he wanted to marry. He wanted to reverse the disobedience of Eden, which happened in a garden. Eve was surrounded by so much beauty and opulence. Adam had everything provided for him, and so Adam and Eve began to believe that they could live without God, that they did not need him, and that indeed he was their rival. To reverse this, God brings the sons and daughters of Abraham into a desert. The desert is a place where human life cannot survive on its own. It is a place with no food, no water, and with dangerous animals. And there God provides for their every need. He gives them quail and manna. He makes water come forth from the rock. And then he leads them to Sinai. And if you open the 19th chapter of the book of Exodus, you hear what happens. God says to Moses, go tell the sons of Jacob, go tell the nation of Israel this. Note how I took you out of Egypt, how I bore you on eagle's wings even unto this place. I have saved you. Now listen, if you keep my commands and are obedient to my voice, I will make you my own special possession, though all the earth is mine. You will be a people consecrated in covenant with me. I will make you a nation of priests, holy people. And Moses carried these words to the people of Israel, and they said, we will do everything the Lord our God has said. That is a marriage scene. That is Israel plighting its troth, to use ancient words, plighting its troth to God. Israel is there entering into a covenant with God as God's bride. God marries Israel in that scene. We see it through the prophets who speak of it later. Open the 2nd chapter of the book of the prophet Hosea. I will lead you into the desert, and there I will allure you. I will allure you there in the desert, and you will call me my husband. Or open the Song of Songs, which has been always understood to be a metaphor of the love between God and his people. You have ravished me, my bride. You have ravished my heart. Your love is better than life. It's so sweet. It's sweeter than anything to me. It is more valuable, listen to this, Tim, it is more valuable than wine. That's what God says. Your love is more valuable than wine. Your oil means more to me than all spices. And so God has married Israel, raising them to his level, for he wants to divinize them. He makes them a nation holy, a nation of priests. And yet we know that the largest part of the rest of the Old Testament is the story of Israel's infidelity to God's covenant. All through, even while they were still in the desert, they grumbled and complained and their hearts were restless. All through the period of the judges, they were people of rebellion and disobedience. During the time of the kings, they gave themselves over to demons and to idols. The ultimate infidelity, the act of adultery in this marriage, was the worship of idols who were demons, even sacrificing their own children to demon gods. And so 600 years after Israel plighted its troth to God in the desert, he sent them away, far from his face, far from his sight, into captivity in Babylon, in punishment for their adultery. Not permanently, but for a time of severe chastisement. This image of Israel as an adulterous wife is all over in the writings of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Hosea. It is most strikingly and memorably and achingly described in the 16th chapter of the book of the prophet Ezekiel. Do you remember? I passed by you when you had just been born. God is speaking here to Israel. I passed by you, and nobody wanted you when you were born. They threw you out in the field. Nobody washed you. Your umbilical cord wasn't even cut. There you were, weltering in your blood. And I passed by and I saw you, and I took pity on you, and I lifted you up, and I cleaned you and provided for your needs, and you grew strong. And then I passed by again, and I saw that you were ready for love, and so I took you to myself. I fed you flour and oil, honey, and you grew strong and beautiful. Your beauty, the news of your beauty, went out to all the nations, and you became famous as the most beautiful of women. And then you used your beauty and lavished it for harlotry. Every person who passed by, you gave yourself to. You wicked wife who prefer strangers to your husband. And yet God would not let this stand either. And so he made a promise. He made a promise that he would restore Israel. In the 62nd chapter of the book of the prophet Isaiah, we hear it. And we will hear it read during this Advent. Okay, I will take you back. No longer will your land be called desolate. No longer will you be rejected. No, your land will become espoused. I will call you married. Just as a young man takes a virgin, so shall your sons take you. As a bridegroom delights in his bride, so will your God delight in you. And so God makes a promise that though Israel is unfaithful to its vows to him, he will restore Israel to her place as his bride. And how does he do it? We know the answer. The incarnation. He sends his own son. Now, open the pages of the gospel and notice that images of marriage and family are everywhere, everywhere, everywhere in the infancy narratives. Zechariah and Elizabeth, Mary and Joseph, the first miracle of Jesus at the wedding at Cana. None of this is incidental. It's part of the plot. It's part of the story. When John the Baptist arose, who was the greatest prophet that Israel had seen in centuries upon centuries, who did he call himself? The friend of the bridegroom, the best man. He had come to prepare the way for a wedding feast. And he said it. He said, the bridegroom who's coming, who's my friend, I'm not worthy to unfasten the sandals on his feet. He must increase, I must decrease. And Jesus calls himself the bridegroom, not simply in the parable of the foolish and wise virgins, but when his apostles are attacked by the Pharisees and scribes for not fasting, do you remember? He says, how can the wedding guests fast when the bridegroom is with them? The day will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then on that day they will fast. He compares himself to the bridegroom. Do you know the longest conversation that Jesus ever has with anyone recorded in the Gospels? Do you know who it's with? It's in the 4th chapter of the book of the evangelist St. John, and it goes for 42 verses. It's his conversation with the Samaritan woman. If we do not understand this parable, we do not know who he is at all. Jesus is going from Jerusalem to Galilee. You can do this in 2 ways. You can skirt over by the Jordan and avoid Samaria, or you can go right through Samaria. He goes right through Samaria with his disciples. He comes to a place called Shechem and sits down by a well that is in a field that used to belong to Jacob, the father of the nation of Israel. His apostles go off to get some food, and he sits there. Shechem is a place, even though it was in Samaria, it's a place that's thick with Jewish memory. It was at Shechem that God said to Abraham that he would give him that land. It was at Shechem that the bones of Jacob were buried in response to a promise that he had asked his son Joseph to make. It was at Shechem that Joshua gave that speech where he said to the people, now it's your time to make a choice. Who will you serve? The gods your fathers served beyond the river? The gods the Canaanites in this land serve? And Joshua says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But choose this day, life or death. Who will you serve? And all the people said, no, we will serve the Lord our God. That's a renewal of vows in Shechem. So Jesus is in that place, and he sits down by that well. What is Jesus thinking about sitting by Jacob's well? The well that Jesus is sitting and resting by is not the only well in the story of Jacob. Do you remember when it was time for Jacob himself to be married, his father Isaac and his mother Rebekah sent him to a faraway land to Rebekah's brother Laban. Jacob went there, and there he found a well, and by the well was a flock of sheep, and tending the flock of sheep was a beautiful woman whose name was Rachel. Jacob rolled the stone away from the entrance of the well, watered Rachel's sheep, and then what did he do? He very shyly said hello to her. No, that's not what happened. He took her into his arms, he kissed her passionately, and then he looked to heaven and he wept and cried for joy. It was the first time they had met. That was not according to protocol. It's with that vision that Jesus meets a woman who comes in the heat of the day to draw water. What is she doing? Women did not draw water at noon by themselves. They drew water in groups in the cool of the day. There must be something wrong with her. She must be ashamed of something. She must be hiding to come at this time in this way. Jesus says to her, "Give me a drink." She's surprised that he would talk to her, a Samaritan woman. She banters with him. Jesus says, if you knew who was talking to you, you would ask him to give you a drink of water, and then you'd never be thirsty again. And she thought, he has had too much heat. And she said, what is wrong with you? You don't have a bucket, and you say that you're going to give me water? Do you think that you're greater than our ancestor Jacob, who owned this field? What does Jesus say? Go get your husband. And then everything changes. She stiffens because a bolt of pain runs through her. She is fearful. She turns white as though she has seen a ghost. For so indeed she has. This woman has caught sight of herself. With Jesus' question for the first time, she sees who she is. And she says to him, I don't have a husband. And he says, that's right. You've had 5 husbands. And the man you're with now is not your husband. The 18th century Englishman Samuel Johnson said that second marriages are the triumph of hope over experience. If such can be said about a second marriage, what can be said about a third, a fourth, or a fifth? How much broken hope is this woman holding within her? Sinclair Lewis, the American playwright who was born in Sauk Center, Minnesota, and died of alcoholism in Rome, wrote a story once about a little businessman who is conducting an affair. And the woman whom he's sleeping with one day says to him, "We seem very different, you and I, but we're really the same. We're desperately unhappy about something, and we don't know why." And then Jesus opens up to this woman and tells her things the likes of which he hid from almost no one else. He reveals to her what he told no one, that he was the Messiah. And then this woman, who had been cowering in shame in response to the affection and the love of Jesus, runs openly into the city where she used to be hiding, shouting at the top of her lungs, "Come, meet the man who told me everything I ever did." Because what was Jesus doing at the well? He wasn't thirsty for water. He was thirsty for her. He was proposing marriage to her. Because Jesus is like my little nephew, John Paul. He wants to marry every girl. He wants to marry everyone. Those 42 verses are Jesus proposing to this woman. You know, in the Eastern Church, they give her the name Photina, which is from the Greek word phos, light. And the story is that she died in the persecutions of Nero alongside Peter and Paul. You know how Mary Magdalene is called the apostle to the apostles? This woman, Photina, is called equal to the apostles. And when Nero could not kill her, do you know what they did? They cast her to the bottom of a dry well where she perished in honor of the Lord. She didn't need water anymore because she had a husband who would last. When we look at Jesus dying upon the cross, we know that this is the act of a bridegroom giving his body over for his bride. Calvary is the consummation of the marriage between divinity and humanity. We know this to be true. If you go to St. Peter's Basilica, where they have just unveiled the restored baldacchino of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, melted from bronze that used to be in the cupola of the Pantheon, if you go there and look carefully, you'll see that in the middle of the greatest building in the history of the world, under the great dome of St. Peter's Basilica, standing over the tomb and the bones of the apostles, of the apostle Peter, is a baldacchino with the high altar at which the Pope celebrates Mass. And what is it? It's a marriage bed. You can see it. It's a marriage bed. If you get close, you look at the inscriptions underneath, there's a face of a woman, and then you go to the next pillar, and the woman is looking agitated, and then you go to the next pillar, and the woman is moaning and crying out, and then you go to the next pillar, and it's a little baby, because she was in labor. The fruitfulness of the marriage between God and his bride, the church, is brought forth in the Eucharist. This is the one flesh union. And this is what St. Paul is writing about in the 5th chapter of his letter to the Ephesians, when he says, I speak of a great and deep mystery, the mystery of Christ and his bride, the church. And then in the book of Revelation, we see it again very clearly. At a certain point, the angel who had held the 7 bowls comes and says, would you like to see? Would you like to see the wife of the Lamb? And then the heavenly Jerusalem descends, decked out as a bride to meet her husband. And at the very end of the Bible, the Spirit and the bride say, come. So notice, the beginning of the Bible is God's signal that he has created us for everlasting union with him, not simply to be with him, but to be in his nature, to be divinized, to be royalty. We see that at the beginning, God's desire. At the end, we see that in the fulfillment of all things, the bride cries out, Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. The bride longs for him. The Bible begins with God's desire for us and ends with our desire for God. Everyone listen, when those two things come together, our yearning for God and God's desire for us, that's called holiness. That's called sanctity. That's called salvation. And it's the whole point. Nothing less, nothing else. Every other aspect of our faith is a series of footnotes to that. And God uses the image of marriage to communicate to us the mystery of his great love. And are we worth it? I think we are forbidden that question. Because you might not think that you're worth very much at all. When you look at your life and how unfaithful you've been, when you look at the lavish promises that God has made to you, all the blessings he's strewn in your path, poured out upon your life, and the way that you've responded, the way that I've responded with such ingratitude and such infidelity. And we think about God and we say, what is wrong with him? Why does he allow himself to be made the fool? Nobody respects a husband whose wife cheats again and again and again and again. And yet here he is, taking us back again and again and again and again. It's amazing. Somehow, in the mystery of God's wisdom, we're worth it. You might not think you are. You can argue with him. But I don't advise it. That's an argument you can't win. Better is to ponder that someone like you could be loved so much, desired so deeply. Consider the value of your soul, that the devil chases it with such hatred and that God pursues it with such ardor and fidelity. Consider the value of your soul in light of the invisible struggle and warfare all around us all the time, in which God will emerge the ultimate victor. And we stay close to him because we know that the battle is his, the victory is his, and his love for us, though it is so confounding, is the foundation of the universe. It's the deepest truth that we could ever assent to or consider. And so let's adore then this God who wants to marry everybody.